Hello again, everyone. I'm Chuck Williams, and welcome to the final episode of our five-part series that we've been covering, Half Truths by Adam Hamilton. Today's discussion, we're going to take a look at the final phrase that Adam Hamilton views as a half-truth, that phrase being, love the sinner, hate the sin. Now, love the sinner, hate the sin. That's a saying that certainly has been around a very long time. When we first look at that saying, love the sinner, hate the sin, well, it's difficult to find very much wrong with that. It seems like it's a good idea. Love the sinner, hate the sin. Somebody says that, it's a pretty good bet that they're saying that with nothing but good intentions. They don't necessarily like the sin, but they certainly love the sinner. A matter of fact, it's such a good saying that it must have come pretty much directly from the Bible. Think about it, it might have even been said at one of the periods of time by Jesus himself. Because after all, Jesus commanded us to love sinners. He even hung around with sinners to prove his point. But the interesting thing about it is that love the sinner, hate the sin, that's actually not in the Bible at all. Most scholars believe that that began to develop right around the late 4th century. In the late 4th century, St. Augustine wrote a letter to an order of nuns. And he was in his letter to this order of nuns, he was asking them to remain strong in their faith and remain chaste. And in this letter, he specifically asked for them to have a love for mankind and a hatred of sin. All in all, that's pretty close. Still closer, if you move forward a few hundred years, you can go to about 1929, the autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi. He had a quote in his autobiography which was, hate the sin and not the sinner. Now, most readers who've ever read Gandhi's autobiography remember that quote, hate the sin and not the sinner. But actually, that was never his full quote. That was the part that people pulled out of it. The actual full quote was, hate the sin and not the sinner is a precept which, though easy enough to understand, is rarely practiced. And that is why the poison of hatred spreads in the world. Which is profoundly different than hate the sin and not the sinner. But even if it didn't come directly from the Bible, still sounds true, right? Well, this is another one of those sayings that Mr. Hamilton phrases as a half-truth. Because it seems like the statement is very well intentioned, seems like it's based on solid reasoning, and like all of the others we have explored, if we look a little deeper, what we might find is this saying to be a little bit problematic. So let's explore why. Let's start with love the sinner. Now, Jesus never actually said, love the sinner. What did Jesus say instead when it came down to how you're supposed to interact with sinners in the world? We can find our answer to that in Matthew. We're going to read from Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5. It says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. For you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others, and you will be measured by the same measure you use. Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the splinter out of your eye, and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye? Hypocrite! First, take the beam of wood out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. Okay, so by the way, this is the verses of scripture that I do read in these discussions do come from the Christian Standard Bible. For my wife and I, it's a little bit easier to read. That's the one that we use for study. So the problem that comes up with love the sinner is approached in a nutshell in that passage. The problem is it's far too often, it's in our nature as human beings that we feel that we should decide who the sinner is that needs to be loved. Not only that, but on many occasions, we'll temper our amount of love for the one that we decide is the sinner based completely on the level of seriousness of the sin we believe they've committed. Now, we'll take a look at the seriousness of sin in a moment, but for now, what we want to kind of do is we want to concentrate on what Jesus actually said. And what he actually said was, it was never love the sinner, it was judge not, lest ye be judged. But he did speak to us on who we should love. And again, when we say what Jesus did not say was love the sinner, let's find out what Jesus did say. Who should we love? Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40. In Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40, he said to him, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. Okay. So, reading from Matthew, what he says is not love the sinner. What he says is love your neighbor as yourself. And there is the whole problem with love the sinner. We believe that we're doing the good, and we believe we're doing the Christian thing by reaching out to show our love and our care for someone who has strayed from God's path. Here's the problem. Who decides what the straying is? We do. When we decide that we're going to reach out to someone who we clearly have the opinion that now they have sinned and they've strayed from God's path and now they need our help, all of these things we decided, okay? It's part of the human condition. When we hear the details of an event, well, then we determine that the person involved in that event has sinned. And then we decide, interestingly enough, which is part of human nature, we decide how much grace we're going to extend to them based upon our opinion of the severity of the infraction. Everything about that scenario says judgment, and it is actually a truism. Again, we talked earlier, and we're going to come back to in a moment, the seriousness of the sin. There are many, many degrees of difficulty in what sins we may perceive someone may or may not have created, and how much grace we give them oftentimes will come down to our shock, our displeasure, our anger, our feelings of what should and should not be. All of it lends very seriously toward judgment. And when we have the phrase, love the sinner, not the sin, that is an open invitation that it would probably be easier said to say, judge the sinner, hate the sin. Okay? So we hear the details, we determine the amount of grace we're going to extend to the sinner, and everything that we're doing kind of says, it's kind of judgment. Now, not quite sure that that's accurate. Okay. Put yourself in the shoes of the sinner. Look at it through their eyes and think about this now. How are you feeling now when someone comes to you and says to you, I hate the sin or the sins you've committed, but I love you, but I hate the sins you've committed. How does that feel? For a lot of folks, they would say it feels kind of like they're letting you know that they know. And it also feels kind of like they've already decided. Nothing in that is necessarily what I think Jesus had in mind. So when Jesus commanded that you love your neighbor as yourself, and he said that that was the second most important commandment of them all, well, that took all judgment away. Your neighbor is a sinner. Love your neighbor. I can remember from when I was young, I would on occasion, there was a saying that I would hear. And that saying was, he needs to get right with God. Usually that was said in a very, very specific tone by someone who really, really wasn't very happy with somebody else. That sounds very judgmental, doesn't it? Now imagine the same scenario, same person, same offense, but instead of he needs to get right with God, a person says, well, Jesus taught me to love my neighbor as myself, and I'm not supposed to be judging the sins of other people anyway. I think that's probably closer to what God had in mind. It's very easy for us to let others know what we feel about the seriousness of their sin and let them know when they need to get right with God. It is not as easy for us to go, Jesus taught me to love my neighbor as myself, and I'm not supposed to be judging the sins of my neighbor. Now, let's go back to the seriousness of sin. If I am to love the sinner but hate the sin, does the severity of the sin itself enter into the question? Or is all sin the same? Kevin ate 3 donuts this morning, despite his doctor saying that Kevin is a borderline diabetic and the Bible saying that his body is a temple. Is Kevin sinning? Are we deciding? If he is sinning, is Kevin sinning worse than Bill, who had, let's say, 2 too many at a party and drove home impaired? That particular night, nobody got hurt, but the risk was there. So is Bill's sin worse? Is Kevin's sin worse? Or is all sin the same? And you can use your own imaginations to plug in varying degrees of sin and ask yourself the same question. The seriousness of the sin, is all sin sin, or is some sin worse than other? Going back to the scriptures, we are reminded of Jesus's reaction. If you remember the story of the woman who was caught in an act of adultery and the crowd wanted to stone her, we can look at that and we can contrast that and Jesus's reaction to the reactions of the spiritual leaders of the time. and his reactions to the money changers. So here's what we had. We had a scenario where you had a woman who was caught in an adulterous relationship, and by the laws, they wanted to stone the woman. And Jesus looked at them and said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Then you can take a look at the reactions that he had when encountering the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, and how angry he was with them for their teachings and their laws. And we can take a look back at the reaction he had to the money changers at the temple, who were changing money so that people could buy stock to sacrifice to God. There's a treasure trove of different examples we can use for the different reactions, but the point to it is this. It seems that Jesus himself understood that different sins carry different weight. And if we as a society are to go around determining how much love we have for a sinner based upon the severity of the sin, I'll tell you, there are not a lot of sinners out there who are going to see a lot of Christian love, especially when the severity of the sin increases. We're human. We judge. I tell my wife way too often, I'm not judging. I'm simply giving my opinion. And it really doesn't fly very well with her either. And that's the sum total of the problem with the saying, we love the sinner, not the sin. But the reality of the matter is that both of those things come with strings attached. We'll hate the sin, but it becomes way too easy to view it more or less harshly depending upon our relationship with the sinner. We'll love the sinner, but that might be dependent upon the severity of the sin. And really, our view of any of it shouldn't matter. We are not supposed to be the ones to judge. So we should not be the ones to say, depending upon what you did here, I'm going to show you lots of Christian love. If it's bad enough, maybe a little less Christian love. If it's really, really bad, maybe I'll just avoid you. And your sin, now I'm going to determine on the scale of 1 to 10 where your sin falls in. And I'm quite certain that may not be what Jesus had in mind. So, keeping to Jesus' words, how do we love our neighbor if our neighbor killed a man? Or if our neighbor hurt a child? I honestly do not have the answers for that, but I can tell you this. Love the sinner. Maybe try to be open to the sinner's repentance as Jesus was to the woman who was to be stoned. Maybe. Hate the sin? Good. Hate the sin. Hate all sin. Hate the existence of sin. Do everything in your own life to keep sin away. I think that's what God truly wants from you anyway. So, love your neighbor. Despise sin all you want. But love your neighbor as yourself. And hate the existence of sin, and do everything you can to keep sin away. That's what I take out of this week's discussion. So, I want to thank you for taking this trip with me over the last 5 weeks. I think we've covered a lot of things. It's been very interesting. David Hodson will be returning to you next week. I invite you to tune in. David's had himself a good little rest, and I'm sure that he has a wonderful series in store for you. I will be back to have more discussion with you again soon. Thank you.